Hi, everyone. Thank you for the opportunity to share this work with you this morning, and thanks for accommodating that I can't be there in person with all of you. Hopefully things will change a little bit so I can bring my reason to AAAE. I'm excited to share Competing Positions, Contextualizing Mobility Through Discourse Analysis on behalf of our team, including Brett Milliken and Josh Stewart at Oregon State University, and I'm Becky Haddad at the University of Minnesota Twin Cities. I'd also like to thank Lavin Rada and Laura Hasselquist for their efforts to make this presentation possible. This morning, we'll talk through a few components of this paper, especially in terms of attempting to understand the work of teacher mobility. We know there is a high expectation for community engagement for SBAE teachers, and migration exposes several pinch points in understanding those expectations. There are a few fundamental differences in how we're going to talk about mobility today. First, we assume that mobility is good for teachers. This doesn't mean mobility isn't hard on districts. Our work, however, validates mobility as a career choice toward improving one's teaching position. Second, teachers operate in school systems through interactions, relationships with colleagues, students, administrators, and the broader community in which the school is situated are key to understanding how teachers engage in their systems. And finally, that these interactions comprise the positions attempted and available to teachers that determine whether or not they see a move as a good career choice. Our purpose was to unfold positions of support and challenge to retain SBAE migrators. We say unfold because as we think about positioning, Davies conceptualizes this as folds in a paper. Any interaction makes a fold that even if the fold is undone, the crease remains for future interactions. We looked at SBAE teachers and community influencers individually in two papers last year. In moving beyond identifying positions, our question for this paper asked how positionalities were taken up, rejected, or reified between the two. We use the literature to orient ourselves to the discourse surrounding teacher mobility within SBAE and the education research more broadly. Based on the literature, we conceptualize the work of teacher mobility in terms of positioning as cyclic. The community positioned the previous teacher and applies that positionality to the new teacher. The new teacher takes up, reifies, or rejects those available positions, and the community subsequently takes up, rejects, or reifies the teacher's attempts at positioning. The making sense between attempted positions and accepted positions are where and how compatibility and fit are determined. Our methods were intertwined with positioning theory to engage participants throughout the process. Our participants all engaged in one school site. We had 2 teachers and 4 community influencers, in addition to the state supervisor who provided some background context for the state for our study. In addition, we accounted for the needed embeddedness to do this type of work by selecting a site at which one of the researchers, me, worked for 5 years. To operationalize positioning as an embedded theory across our methods, we engaged in a co-iterative analysis based in dialogue. First, we collected reflective autobiographies around the episodes of my mobility identified in previous studies and the broader literature base. We transcribed initial interviews, identified rough positions, and researcher reflective memoing, and shared all of these pieces back with our participants prior to our second interview. Our second interview followed up to collect meta-language from participants regarding their experience. This was different from validation in that it was integral to our process of answerability. Rather than a confirmatory process, the second interview asked participants to make sense of their reflective experience and identified the positions, while leaving room for them to clarify or identify other positions they may have occupied. After collecting approximately 25 hours of audio data, we mapped the data by position, order of positioning, type of positioning, evidence of the position, and meta-language. This process also involves substantial sense-making by me as the researcher that shared back to the participants comprised the components of authenticity for our study. Up to this point, all of this has been data collection. The final data mapping product was then again shared back to participants for validation that their experience was captured fully and accurately. After that, We engaged an open coding process to categorize the identified positions into themes. Themes were then shared back to the participants again as findings, aligned with evidence from the data mapping, and the conclusions were co-generated as the participants made meaning of the findings. These were key pieces of reflexivity as we engaged in a continuous and shared reflective process. So that brings us to the findings. Remember, the findings will discuss our reflective rather than observed positions. These still have value as we recognize that the folds of those positions remained even after the interactions had passed. We identified 3 themes to describe how assigned positionalities were occupied by these SBAE migrators and community influencers, including conflicting requirements, I can and I will, and all my love and support. Our first theme examined the way SBAE migrators and community influencers' expectations came up against each other. Conflicting requirements deals largely with assigning roles and responsibilities to oneself or others. Within the conflicting requirements theme, interactions of attempt and intention sought to yield better programmatic results for all involved. However, without all involved agreeing on the right things, it was difficult to find a way forward that allowed SBAE teachers to position themselves as meeting expectations. I can and I will recognized the ways people felt equipped to take on challenges with autonomy, or felt the weight of others' positioning as an imposed limit on their ability to meet their goals. The interesting finding within this theme was the not. Migrators and community influencers took up positions for themselves, but only community influencers positioned SBAE migrators in these ways. While both rely on similar positions, resilient survivor, autonomous individual, and imposter were taken up, reified, and rejected in ways that incited conflict among the participants in the study, especially as we think about what courtesies may be extended based on acknowledging the position of others. Being in a position to support or be supported was an interactional endeavor, showing investment in a person, location, program, or community. In essence, do community influencers position SBAE teachers as equally invested rather than merely invested? Anything less than uptake and reification were a rejection of the investment of community influencers, a slight that caused support and connectedness to crumble as available positions within the SBAE teachers' repertoire. These themes comprised an interesting landscape for SBAE migrators and their community influencers to navigate. First, the expectations from community influencers on SBAE migrators were numerous and varied. Second, survivorship and autonomy were at odds with each other, especially in extending the courtesies of those positions. And finally, positions of support and connectedness tied closely with investment. With these findings in mind, we'll share recommendations in line with our co-iterative, co-generative approach. Our recommendations include those from migrators for the community influencers with whom they interacted, and from community influencers for their SBAE teacher counterparts. You'll also hear us embracing mobility as a vital function of the teaching career, and that's a substantial paradigm shift, warranting support and imposing challenge on a variety of levels. Community influencers shared several recommendations for mobile SBAE teachers. Mobile teachers and their community influencers emphasized a need to focus on having a job versus having the ideal job or being in the ideal geographical location. Those may not be the same thing. This means that teachers must be clear about the desired support, willingness to be connected, and level of commitment to their new community prior to beginning the job search process. In addition, teachers need to know their capacity and willingness to engage in a particular workload and ask questions during the job search that help them understand the program expectations. We'll also talk about understanding those program expectations as a mutual responsibility as a recommendation for other stakeholders as well. Once hired, engaging community influencers early helps distribute the workload and was a request towards developing a program. These come together with operating with responsible autonomy. Operating with freedom requires operating with responsibility. This runs a little counter to the popular career advice of make yourself irreplaceable, as it has to acknowledge that everyone leaves their job. Delegating the workload, setting clear boundaries, and knowing that your audience is well acquainted with hard work can help SBAE teachers operate with responsible autonomy through mobility. Administrators were positioned by others and positioned themselves as having a significant influence on school culture. And this started at the hiring and onboarding processes. Integral to finding and keeping the right fit were interview materials that clarified expectations, continued mentoring teams well beyond the first year, evaluating the obvious, having some kind of room preparation plan, clarifying the ideal, and continued connection. In addition, teachers focused on administrators affecting support, material, time, and emotional. Being creative with resourcing time was something other influencers and SBAE teachers mentioned as a greater resource need than money or content. Ideas to resource time included coordinated planning time, team teaching, team planning, and blocking schedules. Co-teachers, on the other hand, had a much more organic role in mobile teachers finding their fit. By seeking belonging and connection, co-teachers grounded their SBAE counterparts in the things that make teaching survivable. For migrators, establishing connections was equivalent to identifying and maintaining realistic program expectations with the broader community. Teachers with longevity in the community hold key insights regarding those expectations and afford much needed reality checks, preventing their coworkers from taking on too much. They also provided continued mentorship well beyond the first year in a district, even if the co-teacher themselves didn't recognize what they were doing as formal mentoring. And finally, several teachers mentioned how their colleagues saying what they saw was essential in conveying support. Something as simple as someone walking by and inviting the SBAE teacher to a happy hour or saying, "Hey, go home, it's late," were important to SBAE teachers aligning expectations and taking up feasible and sustainable positions in their schools. Finally, FFA and agriculture program alumni saw themselves as integral to the local SBAE program success. This was incredibly personal positionality in terms of the program's success being an indicator of the health of agriculture in a community. This is a reciprocal reminder for teachers to remember how personal this connection is can aid in understanding community investment, particularly when it might seem overbearing. It's also a check for zealous alumni to recognize the role of an alumni member relative to the SBAE program. A more tangible way to affect support likely comes in resourcing. Our teachers expressed less need for money or content resources and more time or opportunities to reduce their decision load. This also implied a need to extend the importance of agriculture beyond the SBAE program. If ag is an integral health indicator for the community, conveying that importance can't fall solely to the SBAE program. A successful SBAE program validated the agricultural legacy, in addition to providing resourcing that reduced decision loads and advancing agriculture beyond the SBAE program. Having a process to outline expectations, such as a manifesto, mission, or visioning process, are integral to making sure expectations are attainable and executed. So much of this goes back to ideas of replaceability as a measure of success, with much of that replaceability hinging on the positions cultivated in any job. Replaceability requires intention, and that was conveyed by each of our participants in the positions they attempted to take up. And with that, thank you again for the opportunity to share this work with you this morning. If you haven't already, please take a minute to introduce yourself to Lavin, since I can't be there to introduce her to you. Thank you so much.